AITA for not wanting to pay for my friend's wedding dress after she told everyone I was her maid of honor without asking me. Sarah and I have known each other for over a decade. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party years back. A time that feels like a different life entirely. From the start, she had that natural magnetic pull about her. The kind of energy that made you feel like you'd been friends forever. She was fun, spontaneous, and always so confident about what she wanted. I found myself swept into her world of wild decisions and big, ambitious plans. And, honestly, I admired that about her. But Sarah's spontaneity, for all the excitement it brought, often had a darker side too. She made decisions without thinking about the consequences. Which was fine when it came to picking a random new restaurant or deciding on a last-minute weekend road trip. But over the years, her impulsive choices began to impact the people around her. She would make plans without consulting me and, more often than not, assume I'd be on board with her every whim. Even then, I had a hard time saying no. Sarah had a way of making you feel like your presence was crucial to her happiness. Like saying no would break the magic of her carefully curated world. So, when she called to tell me she'd gotten engaged, I was genuinely thrilled for her. She had been waiting for this moment, talking about her future husband in vague but hopeful terms for as long as I'd known her. The engagement felt like the culmination of everything she'd wanted. I could hear it in her voice, the excitement, the disbelief. I knew she was ready to dive into wedding planning, probably with the same intensity she brought to everything else in life. A couple of weeks later, she threw an engagement party. A small but well-coordinated affair at a local wine bar. She wore a simple but stunning white dress, and the entire evening seemed to revolve around her radiant glow. Her fiancé, Mark, a quiet but kind-hearted guy, spent most of the night standing by her side, beaming at her like she was the only person in the room. It was a nice evening, one where I could really sense that she had found someone who genuinely adored her. The night felt normal until Sarah decided to give a little speech. It started out sweet, thanking everyone for coming and talking about her excitement for the future. But then, out of nowhere, she announced that I would be her maid of honor. She even added a little comment about how I was the sister she'd always wanted. I froze, staring at her in shock, trying to process her words. Maid of honor? She hadn't even mentioned this to me. Hadn't even hinted that she wanted me to take on such a big role. It was as if she'd made the decision entirely on her own. Just assuming I'd be okay with it. That I'd have the time and energy to devote to this huge responsibility. My job is demanding, sometimes bleeding well into my evenings and weekends. Between work, family, and the occasional time I try to carve out for myself, there was no way I could be the maid of honor she was envisioning. But as I looked around the room, all eyes on me, I felt trapped. Everyone was smiling, nodding, probably assuming that I'd happily agreed to take on the role. That I'd throw myself into wedding planning with the same enthusiasm Sarah had. So, I smiled, gave a little wave, and pretended to be thrilled. It was easier than making a scene. Easier than facing her disappointment in that moment. I told myself I'd talk to her about it later. That I'd find a way to explain that I couldn't take on the role without ruining the evening. But as the party continued, I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. I knew this was going to be difficult. Sarah was counting on me. And as much as I hated the idea of letting her down, I also knew my limits. I couldn't ignore the feeling that this was going to require more time. More emotional energy than I was willing or able to give. The next few days were tough. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, wondering how I'd managed to get myself into this situation. I knew Sarah would be devastated. She had such big dreams for her wedding, for this grand celebration of love that she'd been planning in her mind for years. And now I was going to have to tell her that I couldn't be a part of it in the way she wanted. But I couldn't keep putting it off. I knew I had to tell her, to be honest, and hope she'd understand. The conversation I'd been dreading with Sarah finally came a few days after the party. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Couldn't keep brushing off the reality that I just didn't have the time or energy to be her maid of honor. I went over 1,000 different ways to break the news in my head. But nothing felt quite right. I knew Sarah, and I knew how invested she was in every aspect of her wedding. For her, The wedding wasn't just an event, it was a dream she'd nurtured for years. And that made it all the harder. We met at a cozy little cafe she liked. A place she often went to relax and unwind. She greeted me with her usual energy, beaming and chatting about the wedding, already buzzing with excitement over the planning process, as she launched into a monologue about color schemes and floral arrangements. I felt my chest tighten. How was I going to tell her? How could I let her down without it feeling like I was pulling the rug out from under her? After a bit of small talk, I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what I had to say. Sarah, I began carefully, I need to talk to you about the maid of honor role. She looked at me, and I could tell she wasn't expecting what was coming next. I explained as gently as I could, telling her how honored I felt that she thought of me, that she wanted me by her side on her big day, but that I simply couldn't commit to the role. My job was demanding, my schedule unpredictable, and as much as I wanted to be there for her, I knew I wouldn't be able to give her the time and attention she deserved. I thought that by explaining it calmly, logically, she might understand, but her face changed almost instantly. Her expression, once cheerful and full of hope, hardened. I could see the hurt creeping into her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line as she tried to process what I was saying. She didn't try to hide her disappointment. For Sarah, this wasn't just about my availability, it was about my loyalty, my commitment to our friendship. And I could feel the disappointment radiating from her, thick and heavy, settling into the space between us. You're really saying no? She finally asked. Her voice strained. There was a mixture of disbelief and frustration in her tone, as though she couldn't quite believe that I would refuse her. I nodded, my heart sinking. I'm sorry, Sarah, I really am, but I don't think I can give you what you need. You deserve someone who can be fully present, someone who can be there for all the little things. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see her shoulders tense. But you're my best friend, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Isn't it kind of your duty? Don't you want to be there for me? I felt a pang of guilt at her words. I did want to be there for her, but there was a difference between supporting her and being able to shoulder the full responsibility of a maid of honor. I tried to explain, to make her understand that this wasn't about my loyalty or my commitment to our friendship. But she didn't want to hear it. To her, my refusal was personal, a rejection not just of the role, but of her. In that moment, I could see years of friendship hanging in the balance. Every shared laugh, every late-night conversation, every memory, it all seemed to teeter precariously on the edge of her reaction. She looked at me like I'd betrayed her, like I'd done something unforgivable, and I had to force myself not to let the weight of her disappointment pull me back into agreeing. Not to let the guilt override my own limits. Sarah, I know this is hard to hear, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But please understand that I'm still here for you. I'll still help with the planning. Go dress shopping with you. Anything you need, just not as the maid of honor. Her expression didn't soften, she just shook her head, eyes cast down, muttering something about how I was making this all about me. In her mind, there was no acceptable reason for me to decline, and I could feel the wall going up between us. Could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface. The conversation ended on a cold note. She didn't say much more, just brushed off my apology with a forced smile and a nod, saying she understood, but in that clipped, icy way that meant she didn't understand at all. I could tell she felt hurt, betrayed, and maybe even abandoned. And as I watched her leave the cafe without so much as a backward glance, I felt the weight of her disappointment settle onto my shoulders. For days afterward, I was haunted by our conversation. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if there was some other way I could have explained it. Some way that wouldn't have left her so angry and hurt. I knew I'd made the right choice for myself, but seeing the impact it had on her nod at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that, in her eyes, I'd failed her as a friend. A part of me wondered if I was being selfish, if I should have just accepted the role for her sake. But another part of me knew that I had to set boundaries. That agreeing to be her maid of honor when I couldn't give it my full attention would have only hurt both of us in the long run. I wanted to support her, but not at the expense of my own sanity. And yet, as each day passed, the guilt only grew. I knew that things would never quite be the same between us. even though I'd tried to be honest. To explain myself with kindness. I'd crossed a line in her mind. A line that couldn't be uncrossed. I had to accept that our friendship might be forever changed because of it. After the awkward, painful conversation at the cafe, Sarah and I didn't speak for a few days. I felt the emptiness of the silence between us like a weight. Usually, she'd text me throughout the day with updates on her wedding planning or just little thoughts. Now, my phone stayed silent. I told myself I needed to give her space, to let her process her disappointment. But the silence was deafening, making me question if I'd truly made the right choice in stepping back from the maid of honor role. Then, about a week later, Sarah texted me, asking if I'd come with her to try on wedding dresses. She wrote it in a straightforward way, almost like she was doing me a favor by inviting me. She didn't address our last conversation, didn't apologize or ask for one. She simply wanted me to show up. I took it as a small peace offering, a chance to reconnect, even if she was still hurt. Part of me was nervous, unsure if the bitterness from our previous conversation would linger. But another part of me genuinely missed her, missed the easy flow of our friendship. This was her big moment, and I wanted to be there for her, to be the friend she needed, even if she saw me as just another guest in her bridal entourage. When I arrived at the bridal shop, Sarah was already there, dressed in a long, satin robe and holding a small bouquet of sample flowers. The boutique was quaint and intimate, one of those places that felt like a bridal fairy tale brought to life. White lace, blush-colored silk, and gentle lighting cast a soft glow over the room. Sarah looked beautiful, her excitement lighting up her face. She was back in her element, and I could tell she was reveling in the attention, in the way everything revolved around her. I couldn't help but smile. Despite the tension between us, Sarah's mom was there, too, along with two of her cousins. They greeted me with polite smiles, and we all gathered around as she began trying on different dresses. The atmosphere was pleasant enough, though I felt a slight chill whenever Sarah's gaze lingered on me for too long. I could tell she was still harboring resentment, a subtle reminder that she hadn't completely forgiven me. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on her happiness, on the glow she radiated every time she saw herself in a new dress. As she modeled gown after gown, I began to see glimpses of the friend I'd always known. She twirled in the mirror, asked for our opinions, laughed at her mom's insistence on certain styles. For a while, it almost felt like old times. Like the hurt and disappointment had faded into the background. I found myself leaning into the moment, letting go of my own anxieties and focusing on the excitement of helping her find her dream dress. Then, in the middle of trying on a particularly intricate gown, Sarah froze in front of the mirror, her eyes lighting up as she took in the dress. It was stunning, a fitted bodice with delicate lace detailing, a flowing train that seemed to go on forever. She looked like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. Everyone in the room went quiet, watching as she took in the reflection, a small smile tugging at her lips. But I could see the hesitation in her eyes. This dress was beautiful, perfect even, but it was also far more expensive than she'd budgeted for. Her mom and cousins exchanged glances, unsure what to say, and I could sense the disappointment settling in as she realized this perfect dress, was out of reach. Then, to my surprise, Sarah turned to me. "You know," she said with a forced, casual tone, "since you're not covering any of the other wedding expenses, maybe you could help me with the dress?" Her voice was light, but there was a hint of expectation in her eyes, an unspoken assumption that I would jump at the chance to make up for not being her maid of honor. I froze, caught completely off guard. The room went silent, everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd respond. I could feel my heart pounding, a mixture of shock and disbelief coursing through me. She hadn't asked if I'd be willing to contribute, she'd simply announced it. As if this was something I owed her, a way to make up for declining her maid of honor role. I could feel the weight of her disappointment pressing down on me. But something inside me resisted the idea of giving in, of once again bending to her expectations without even being asked. I took a steadying breath, gathering my thoughts. I wanted to be careful, to choose my words in a way that would minimize any further damage. But I also knew I had to be firm. Sarah, I'm really sorry, but I can't cover the dress, I said, keeping my voice calm but resolute. That's a big expense, and I don't feel comfortable with it, especially since this wasn't something we discussed. Her face fell, and for a moment, I could see a flash of something darker behind her eyes, disappointment mingled with anger. An emotion that felt far more intense than the situation warranted. She looked at me like I'd just ruined everything. Like my refusal to help pay for the dress was the ultimate betrayal. You're being so selfish, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd at least be willing to support me in this. Even if you're not going to be there for the rest of the wedding. Her words stung, sharp and cutting. I could feel my face flush. A mixture of embarrassment and frustration bubbling up inside me. She wasn't just disappointed, she was angry, accusing me of failing her in the moment she needed me most. And once again, I felt trapped, caught between my desire to help her and my need to protect my own boundaries. But I held my ground. I knew that giving in now would only lead to more expectations, more demands, and I couldn't keep bending over backward to appease her. This was her wedding, her moment, but I also had my own limits, my own financial boundaries, and I needed her to respect that. In a huff, Sarah stormed out of the bridal shop, leaving her mom and cousins to glance at each other awkwardly before following after her. I was left standing there alone, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. Part of me felt relief. I had stood up for myself, refused to be pressured into something I wasn't comfortable with. But another part of me felt a familiar pang of guilt, wondering if I was, in fact, being selfish, if I was letting her down in her time of need. As I walked out of the shop, I couldn't help but feel that our friendship had shifted again, a subtle but undeniable shift that left a hollow ache in my chest. Sarah's words echoed in my mind, her accusations of selfishness cutting deeper than I cared to admit. I wanted to be there for her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my friendship was only valuable to her when it came with no boundaries, no limitations, and as much as I loved her, I couldn't keep sacrificing my own needs for her expectations. I drove home in silence, the memory of her anger lingering in my mind, a bitter reminder of just how fragile our friendship had become. After the disaster of the dress shopping day, I tried to put the situation with Sarah out of my mind. But the memory lingered. Her reaction felt like a heavy weight pressing on me, impossible to ignore. In some ways, I felt relieved. I had finally set a boundary. But as the days passed, doubt crept in. I kept replaying her words, her accusation that I was selfish, her expectation that I would foot the bill simply because I wasn't handling other wedding duties. The guilt gnawed at me, yet so did the frustration. It wasn't just about the money or even the dress. It was the assumption that my only value to her was in what I could provide. That my friendship meant jumping through hoops and meeting her every demand. It made me question everything. Had our friendship always been this one-sided? Or was I only now beginning to see it? A few days later, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. I hesitated, nervous about opening it, but curiosity got the best of me. Her message was curt and direct. No warmth or friendliness to soften her words. If you're not going to help with the wedding, she wrote, I'd appreciate if you at least keep your opinions to yourself about how I choose to manage things. This is a special time for me, and I don't need negative energy. Negative energy. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they implied that my reluctance to be the maid of honor or pay for her dress was some form of hostility. A betrayal of our friendship. I couldn't believe it. After everything we'd shared, all the years of listening to each other's problems, celebrating each other's victories, she was boiling it down to a single wedding. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to fire off an equally blunt reply. Instead, I decided to wait, to give myself a moment to think, to consider if this friendship was worth the constant guilt, the constant feeling of failing her. For the next few days, Sarah and I barely communicated. It was an odd silence, a strange contrast to our usually chatty texts and calls. I knew she was hurt, probably angry, but I also knew I couldn't keep sacrificing my own boundaries just to keep her happy. I wanted to support her, yes, but not at the cost of my own sanity. I couldn't be her maid of honor. I couldn't pay for her dream dress. and I couldn't keep pretending that everything she asked was reasonable. Then, that weekend, I met up with some mutual friends. The gathering was relaxed, a casual brunch to catch up. But I could sense something was off. They exchanged glances whenever Sarah's name came up, avoiding direct eye contact with me. Eventually, one of them, Laura, couldn't hold it in any longer. "So, I heard about the dress situation," she said, trying to sound nonchalant but failing. I looked at her, surprised. "Sarah told you about that?" Laura nodded, looking uncomfortable. "She's been really stressed about the wedding. You know, she feels like you're not there for her." There it was again, that underlying accusation. That feeling of being judged for not bending to Sarah's every whim. I felt my stomach sink. It seemed Sarah had gone to our friends with her version of events, making it sound like I'd abandoned her during her special time. And now, our friends were echoing her sentiments, whether they meant to or not. The rest of brunch was tense. Our friends were polite, careful not to outright criticize. But their hesitation spoke volumes. They thought I was being unreasonable, that I was being a bad friend. It didn't seem to matter that I had legitimate reasons for setting boundaries. All they saw was that I wasn't giving Sarah exactly what she wanted. For the first time in our friendship, I felt genuinely alone, like my side of the story didn't even matter. When I got home, I felt drained, defeated. I'd gone to brunch hoping for some support, maybe even reassurance. But instead, I'd left feeling like the villain. Sarah had spun the situation to paint herself as the victim, and I was the one who had somehow wronged her. My patience was wearing thin, and I found myself questioning why I was putting up with all this. Then, to my surprise, Sarah called. Part of me didn't want to answer, but I knew ignoring her would only escalate things. I braced myself, answering with a cautious, "Hey." Her tone was cold, distant. "I just wanted to let you know that I've asked my cousin to be my maid of honor. Since you're not up for it." There was a harshness in her words that cut through me. She wasn't just informing me, she was punishing me, making it clear that she'd found someone willing to step up where I hadn't. I fought to keep my voice steady, to stay calm. "That's fine, Sarah," I replied, hoping she wouldn't notice the strain in my voice. "I'm sure she'll be great." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A silence thick with resentment. Finally, she spoke, her tone almost mocking. "You know, it's just disappointing. I thought my best friend would actually want to be there for me." Her words struck a nerve, and before I could stop myself, I felt a surge of anger rising in my chest. I'd spent weeks dealing with her demands, her expectations, her judgment, all while keeping my own feelings buried. I wanted to be there for her, but I wanted to be there on my terms, not as some extension of her perfect wedding fantasy. "Sarah, I am there for you," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I just can't be everything you expect me to be. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I can support you without sacrificing my boundaries." She scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Boundaries? You make it sound like I'm asking so much of you." "You are, Sarah," I replied, unable to hold back any longer. "You've expected me to drop everything, to be your maid of honor without even asking, to pay for a dress because it's not in your budget. I'm trying to support you, but it feels like that's never enough." There was silence on the other end, and I could feel the distance between us growing with each passing second. I knew I'd crossed a line, but I also knew I couldn't keep bending to her will. This wasn't just about a wedding, this was about our friendship. About the years I'd spent trying to keep her happy at the expense of my own needs. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and detached. "I guess I was wrong about us. I thought you'd be different." With that, she hung up, leaving me standing there, phone in hand, feeling like a weight had both lifted and crashed down on me at the same time. The relief of finally standing up for myself was tempered by the sadness of knowing that our friendship might not survive this. In the days that followed, I heard from a few friends who'd gotten wind of the situation. Some were supportive, understanding that I needed to set boundaries. Others were less forgiving, echoing Sarah's disappointment, saying I could have just gone along to make her happy. But as much as I missed the closeness we once shared, I knew I'd made the right decision. I couldn't keep living in her shadow. Couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for her approval. This wedding, this dress, this entire ordeal, it had all revealed the cracks in our friendship that I'd ignored for too long. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. In the days following that final conversation with Sarah, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt relieved that the weight of her expectations was finally off my shoulders. But the other part, the part that had been her friend for years, the part that had grown accustomed to bending for her sake, was struggling with the loss. Our friendship wasn't officially over, but it felt like the connection we once shared was irreversibly damaged. The silence between us settled heavily over my daily life. We'd been so close for so long that almost everything reminded me of her. Even simple things, like scrolling through my phone, triggered a wave of mixed emotions. I found myself replaying her words. The cold way she'd dismissed me. As if the years of friendship meant nothing. It was painful, but I kept reminding myself that I'd done what was necessary. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own needs to keep her happy. The awkwardness didn't stop with Sarah, though. It extended to our mutual friends. Sarah and I shared a close-knit circle. Friends who'd been with us through milestones, celebrations, and hard times. Now, I was left with the daunting realization that many of them had only heard Sarah's side of the story. And, of course, her version painted me as the uncooperative friend who wouldn't go the extra mile for her wedding. One evening, I received a call from Laura, a mutual friend who had been at that fateful brunch. I could tell from her hesitant tone that she wasn't entirely on my side. But she sounded like she genuinely wanted to understand. I know things have been tense. She started, carefully choosing her words. Sarah's really hurt. You know, she feels abandoned. I could sense the weight of her words. The implication that maybe I'd been too harsh. That I hadn't considered the full impact of my actions. But I took a deep breath, ready to explain myself once more. Laura, I didn't abandon her. I've been supportive in every way I could. I just couldn't do everything she expected. She didn't even ask me to be her maid of honor. She just assumed I'd do it. Like it was an obligation. Laura was quiet for a moment, absorbing my words. I get that, she finally replied. But this wedding is really important to her. And I think she just expected you to want to be there for her. I'm not saying it's fair. But, she's going through a lot. It felt like no matter how many times I explained myself, people kept circling back to Sarah's perspective. I understood the importance of her wedding. I understood her excitement. But what about me? What about my boundaries? I had a full-time job. My own responsibilities. My own life. The idea that my only role in this friendship was to be a cheerleader for Sarah's happiness started to feel not just exhausting, but fundamentally unfair. After that conversation, I felt even more isolated. I had expected at least one friend to understand, to offer me the validation I couldn't give myself. But instead, I felt dismissed, as though I were being selfish for having limitations. I began to wonder if the problem was with me. If I really was the unsupportive friend she painted me to be. More friends reached out in the days that followed, each of them trying to stay neutral, though some were obviously leaning in Sarah's favor. The consensus seemed to be that while my reasons made sense, I still should have tried harder to be there for her. Some of them even hinted that paying for the dress would have been an easy way to smooth things over. As if a financial gesture would erase the deeper issues between Sarah and me. One afternoon, I decided to meet up with my friend Jenna, someone who hadn't been directly involved in the wedding drama. Jenna and I had known each other for years, and I trusted her perspective. We met at a coffee shop, and after a bit of small talk, I finally opened up about the entire situation, sharing every detail from Sarah's surprise maid of honor announcement to the dress shop disaster. When I finished, Jenna gave me a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "It sounds like Sarah's putting way too much on you. You did the right thing by setting boundaries." Her words felt like a lifeline. A small piece of validation I desperately needed. "Thank you," I said, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I don't understand why everyone else seems to think I'm in the wrong." Jenna tilted her head thoughtfully. "I think some people don't understand what it means to set boundaries. Especially when it comes to close friendships. They think you should be willing to do anything for your best friend. No questions asked. But real friendship isn't about ignoring your own needs to keep someone else happy. Her words struck a chord. For years, I'd allowed Sarah's wants and needs to dictate our friendship. But at what cost? I'd slowly become a passive participant in her life. There to support her dreams, her desires, her moments. But this wedding had forced me to confront the imbalance. To realize that friendship shouldn't come at the expense of my own well-being. As Jenna and I parted ways, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. I hadn't been wrong for standing my ground. I hadn't been selfish for refusing to pay for her dress or declining the maid of honor role. I'd simply chosen to prioritize my own peace, my own boundaries, a decision that I shouldn't feel guilty for making. The fallout with Sarah wasn't just about a wedding. It was about years of unspoken expectations and the silent resentment that had built up as I constantly put her needs before my own. In a way, her wedding had been the tipping point. The moment where I finally allowed myself to say, enough. Over the next few weeks, I continued to hear bits and pieces from our mutual friends. Sarah had gone ahead with her wedding planning, choosing her cousin as her maid of honor and, from what I heard, focusing all her energy on creating the perfect day. I could feel the distance between us solidifying. And though it was painful, I felt a strange sense of peace. 2. This whole experience forced me to re-evaluate what I wanted from my friendships. I realized that I needed people who valued me for who I was. Not for what I could provide or how much I could sacrifice. I needed friendships built on mutual respect, on an understanding that supporting each other didn't mean erasing our own needs. Eventually, I heard that Sarah's wedding had gone off without a hitch. Friends posted photos online, smiling faces, beautifully decorated tables, and a radiant Sarah in her wedding dress, though it wasn't the one I'd been asked to pay for. I felt a pang of sadness seeing those pictures. A bittersweet reminder of what our friendship had once been. But I knew that the space I'd created was necessary. That it had allowed me to finally step into a version of myself that didn't need to live in someone else's shadow. The silence between us continued, and I made peace with the possibility that it might never end. I'd lost something, yes, but I'd gained something, too. The courage to stand up for myself. To set boundaries even when it felt uncomfortable. Even when it risked losing someone I loved. I could only hope that one day Sarah might understand. That she might come to see that friendship wasn't about fulfilling expectations, but about respecting each other's limits. About being there without asking for anything in return. And if that day never came, I'd be okay with that too. In the months that followed Sarah's wedding, I kept waiting for some sign that our friendship might still be salvageable. Every so often, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, tempted to text her a simple, "Hi," or ask how she was doing. But each time, I'd stop myself, reminded of the tension, the accusations, and the weight of the expectations she had placed on me. I knew that if I reached out now, without a real conversation about what had happened, I'd risk falling back into old patterns. I'd risk giving up the hard-won boundaries I'd finally set. I was surprised by how freeing it was to have that distance. For so many years, I had been used to Sarah's constant presence. Her endless stream of plans. Her voice in my ear dictating where I should be and what I should do. With her out of my day-to-day life, I found space to breathe. To focus on my own life. My own needs. And as time passed, I realized just how much of myself I had set aside to keep her happy. That sense of peace, though, was complicated. Losing a friend is never easy. And even with the relief of boundaries, I felt the ache of absence. I missed her humor, the way she could make even the smallest events feel like grand adventures. I missed the memories we had shared, the milestones we'd celebrated together. But I also knew that the version of Sarah I missed was different from the one who had emerged in the months leading up to her wedding. Somewhere along the line, her expectations had grown to a point where I was no longer a friend, but a resource to be managed. A source of support that she could tap into whenever she needed. It was a hard truth to accept. But I knew that setting boundaries had been necessary for both of us. I couldn't keep bending myself to fit into the mold she wanted. To sacrifice my own well-being for her happiness. As much as I'd hoped for reconciliation, I began to realize that the only way to truly move forward was to let go. One evening, a few months after the wedding, I received a message from Sarah. Seeing her name pop up on my screen filled me with a rush of mixed emotions: hope, fear, and a lingering sense of sadness. The message was short, just a single line: "I miss you." It was an olive branch. Simple and direct. And for a moment, I felt the pull to respond. To tell her I missed her too. To open the door to a conversation that might finally bridge the gap between us. But I hesitated. I knew that if I replied without addressing the underlying issues, we'd be right back where we started. I'd be expected to fall back into my old role. To support her unconditionally, without any regard for my own limits. Instead of responding immediately, I let myself sit with the message, giving myself time to reflect on what I really wanted. Did I want to rebuild our friendship? Or was I simply holding on to the nostalgia of what it had once been? Eventually, I decided to write back. But carefully. I knew I needed to set the tone. To make it clear that while I valued her, things couldn't go back to the way they were before. I couldn't be her emotional crutch, her safety net, without any acknowledgement of my own boundaries. "Hi, Sarah," I typed, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I considered my words. "I miss you too, but I think we need to have a real conversation about what happened and what we both want from this friendship. I'd love to reconnect, but only if we can both respect each other's boundaries." I pressed send, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. It was a small message, but it represented everything I had been working toward: honesty, self-respect, and the courage to set limits with the people I cared about. I didn't know how she would respond, but I knew that I had taken a step in the right direction. One that honored both my love for her and my need for boundaries. Her reply came a day later. She thanked me for being open and agreed that we should talk. Though her tone was cautious. We set a date to meet at a coffee shop. A neutral space where we could finally lay everything out on the table. When we met, there was an initial awkwardness between us. A lingering sense of tension that neither of us could ignore. But as we started talking, I could see that she was genuinely trying to understand my perspective. To recognize the toll her expectations had taken on me, I told her how it felt to be constantly held to her standards. To be expected to sacrifice my own needs to meet hers. I explained that friendship, to me, meant mutual respect, not constant obligation. She listened quietly, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of the friend I had known years ago. The one who had once valued my happiness as much as her own. She apologized, acknowledging that her focus on the wedding had clouded her perspective. That she had taken my support for granted. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one, and I could feel the air clearing between us. By the end of our talk, we both knew that things wouldn't be the same as they once were. Our friendship had changed, and there was no going back. But there was a chance to move forward, to rebuild something new based on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. As we hugged goodbye, I felt a sense of closure. A peace that came from knowing I had finally honored my own needs. Setting boundaries with Sarah had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But it had also been the most freeing. I had learned that true friendship wasn't about sacrifice, it was about balance. About knowing when to say yes and when to say no, even when it wasn't easy. From that day forward, Sarah and I stayed in touch. Though our relationship took on a new form. We were friends, yes, but with a respect for each other's boundaries that hadn't existed before. And though I still missed parts of the friendship we'd once had, I felt a deep sense of pride for standing up for myself. For finally learning that saying no could be an act of love. Both for myself and for those I cared about. In the end, I wasn't the same person I'd been when Sarah first announced I'd be her maid of honor. I was stronger, more confident, and more aware of my own worth. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had made the right choice.